So in the previous video, we took a look at how to create cameras and also how to do camera cuts in iClone. In this video, we're going to take a look at some other properties of our cameras, properties that will also help it simulate real-world cameras, and we'll look at other ways that we can animate our cameras. And just to clean things up a little bit, I'm starting with the same file that we left off on in the previous video, but I'm going to go ahead and delete these three cameras here. We'll be creating some new cameras, but we'll go ahead and keep the camera full shot that I had created earlier. And I'm going to go to my preview, which is my working view, and we'll take a look at some things that we can do with our cameras. And to do so, I think what I'll do is put another character in our scene. So we've got Natalie in here now. We're going to go ahead and select Christian, drag him in here, drop him in here like that. Since we've got Natalie in a pose, I suppose that we should put Christian in a pose as well. So I'll go ahead and go to my animation tab here, and we'll pick a pose for him and drag it onto him. That works for me. And I think we'll move him back in space so he's standing back here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and switch back over to my camera full shot. So we're using that camera, and we're going to just place the camera a little differently. Perhaps something like this. That works pretty nicely. And we'll see what we can do with this camera, some other techniques that we can use to make our camera work more interesting in iClone. So I think the first thing we'll look at is depth of field. I'm going to go ahead and select my camera from my scenes here so that we're seeing its properties here in the Modify panel. And we'll find the depth of field here. Here it is, right here, depth of field. And to turn it on, we need to activate it. So I'll go ahead and click on this checkbox. And what you will notice is that everything just became very blurry. Now, what can we do about that? Well, the first thing we want to do is decide what we actually want to have in focus. Do we want to have Christian in focus or Natalie in focus? Let's go ahead and put Natalie in focus. And there's a number of ways that we can do that. One way would be to look at this focus distance in the slider, and we could just slide the slider to change what is in focus. Or we could also click on Pick Target and then select what we want to be in focus, in this case Natalie, so I'll go ahead and click on her. And now Natalie is in focus and Christian is slightly out of focus. Now, if you want to further fine-tune this depth of field property, there are some other parameters here under the blur settings. So for instance, if we want Christian to be a little less in focus, a little more out of focus than he currently is, we could try some of these sliders. And as you can see, I can make him blurrier, in this case by dragging this slider to the left. So let's see how we can animate this property, this depth of field of our camera. Remember that you have your timeline here, and that these numbers here indicate frames, and you can think of frames as either individual images in a sense, if you're talking animation and video, or you can think of them also as a unit of measurement, a unit of time. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to scrub my timeline to, we'll do something quite, give ourselves a lot of frames. I'm going to scrub it to frame 200. I will select my camera to make sure that the camera is what I'm currently working on in my modify panel over here. And I'm still under the depth of field, and what I'm going to do is pick a new target to be in focus, and in this case I'll pick Christian. Let's try that again. Doesn't appear to be working. Ah, there it goes. I don't know, it just didn't like where I was clicking, I guess. But now you can see he's in focus and Natalie is out of focus. And if we were to scrub in our timeline, you'll see that that effect is actually animated over time. Let's go ahead and play this animation and see what it looks like. And you can see it's making that transition over 200 frames. Now we're going to try speeding this up a little bit. 200 frames is quite a bit, and I think it'll have more impact if we have it happen over a quicker period of time. Remember that when you're working the timeline, you need to select what is visible here in the timeline here. And to do so, you can click on this button here that's on the far left of your timeline. And you can select what you see here in the timeline. In this case, we want to take a look at the camera that we have in here. And there it is. Here's the camera. And in fact, I can see the keyframe here. If we go to this little drop down here on there, we can also make the depth of field visible. You can see the key here. What we're going to do is we're going to make it, let's see, over, let's say, the first 100 frames, Natalie will be in focus. So I'm going to take this keyframe and move it over here to frame 100. And then over the course of, I don't know, maybe about 12 frames or so, we'll have the depth of field change and put Christian in focus. So we'll go ahead and select that key as well, move it to the left to 112. We'll see if that's a good amount of time. And we'll go ahead and play this. And you can see that that works quite nicely. We get that nice transition very quickly over 2 frames where it goes from Natalie in focus to Christian. So that's a little bit about how you can animate the depth of field. Let's take a look at a few more properties that we can simulate real cameras with in iClone. So we've looked at depth of field. I still have my camera selected here. I'm going to move up in the modify panel and we're going to take a look at this here, the focal length. And what I want you to think about is these as lenses, and you can also think about it as the zoom on a camera that you might have. So what you'll notice is that if I take this focal length and I slide it to the right, it's as if we're zooming in, and if I bring it to the left, it's as if we are zooming out. We can also switch to these different lenses by clicking on these different buttons. And as you can see, that is also affecting this focal length here. Now, just so that it's absolutely clear what is going on here, remember that this is really like a zoom on a camera, or it's like swapping out different lenses for your camera. We are actually not physically moving the camera in when we adjust this value. let's test that out. So I think what I'll do is come over here, we'll deactivate the depth of field for now, so that we don't have any depth of field. We're not going to be focusing on that right now anyway. And we'll come back over here and we're going to animate this focal length. In fact, I'll go ahead and click on the 20 millimeter, and then we could go to frame 50. Put on 35. We'll go to frame 100. We'll do 50, 150, and so on. We'll try each one of these settings. And then if we scrub in our timeline and we play, you'll see that it looks like the camera is zooming in. But very importantly, if we look at it in the preview window, you'll see that our camera is here. But when we scrub in our timeline, the camera itself is not moving at all. But you will notice that as I scrub the timeline here, that this property, the focal length, is changing. Let's go ahead and switch over to my viewport here, and we'll switch over to that camera so you can see it here. We're still looking at the camera here, and again, if I scrub in my timeline, you'll see that it in fact is having the effect, the intended effect. But once again, the camera itself has remained static. It's remained in the same position in 3D space. So again, remember that this is another property that simulates real-world cameras, and we can actually animate this property over time. Now, you'll remember that I animated that by actually clicking on these presets here, but you should understand that you can also animate it using the slider itself. So I'm going to go ahead and scrub in my timeline and go to frame 250. You can see where the camera, how it's been zoomed in. We'll go to frame 300 now, and this time I'm simply going to take the slider and drag it back like this, and you'll see that that also will animate it. One thing that's interesting here is that it appears that I actually still do have the depth of field on it. When I clicked on activate, it seems to actually be an animatable property. That I was not expecting, actually. So you can see it's activated. That's why we have it, even though I thought I had turned it off. If I scrub in my timeline, you'll notice that it is deactivated here. So it appears once again that there is a property in here, that is a property that can be animated over time. As a quick fix for that, I'm simply going to delete my depth of field keys here. And now we shouldn't have any of that depth of field effect on our camera. So we've looked, in this video, we've looked at depth of field, and we've looked at changing the focal length of our camera. And remember that when we changed that focal length, the camera itself did not move in 3D space. It was more like using the zoom feature on a camera. So let's take a look at what happens, or how we can actually move our camera in 3D space. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create another camera. And we're currently looking through that new camera. I'm going to call this camera Camera Move, just so that it's apparent what we're going to be doing with it. I think I will change that back to the 50 millimeter. And this time we're going to actually move the camera in space, and we'll take a look at a couple different ways we can do that. Currently I have this other camera in my timeline, but because we're going to be working with the Camera Move camera, I'm going to come over here and I will turn that camera, well, we'll hide that camera in the timeline, and we'll make the other camera visible, the camera that we're going to currently be working in. I'm going to first switch over to the preview so that we can take a look at this. I have the camera selected here. Let me hide the other camera in here. Remember that you can come over here to the Scenes tab and you can hide and unhide things that way. I've got the Camera Move selected here. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to the mini viewport, and I'm going to change it to that Camera Move so that you can actually see what's happening when I physically move the camera in 3D space. So let's see what happens. I'll take that camera and we'll move it on the Y-axis, and as you can see, this time the camera is moving in 3D space, and it's updating here in our mini viewport so that we can see what it's actually doing. Let's go ahead and try this. We'll try bringing the camera further back. And I'll just move the camera a little bit so that we get a better view, maybe something like this. You can see what it's doing here. I am on my first frame here, so currently it's not animated, but we'll go ahead and go to frame 100. And I'm going to move the camera in. Maybe we'll move it a little over this way as well. Move it out a little. That's a little too close. Something like that. So far we've only moved it through translation, not rotation. But what you'll notice is that if I scrub in my timeline, the camera itself is physically moving in 3D space. Let's go ahead and view it here in this larger window. So I'll select that camera, Camera Move, and if we play this, you'll see that in fact the camera moves toward the subjects in our composition here. Now, of course, besides just moving it in the 3D space, we can rotate as well. So let's give that a try. I'm going to go back to that frame 100. We'll look at the mini viewport here, and I'll change it back to my working camera preview so I can take a look at the scene a little bit more easily. And let's see, what we'll do is we'll take the camera and let's see, how shall we do this? I'm gonna take a look at this more from a top view, something like this. Camera's selected. I'm going to move it over here, so we're once again moving it in 3D space, but we can also rotate our camera. Maybe move it back a little. Something like that. So let's see what happens now when we scrub in the timeline. You'll notice that the camera is going to rotate and move in 3D space. If we switch our view from preview to our camera move and we play it, you'll see what our camera does. Not the nicest camera movement, but with a little bit of tweaking, we could get it to look more like what we want it to look like. In fact, we could add more keyframes in here. Maybe we don't like how Natalie goes off screen like that, so let's see if we can fix that. Go once again to my preview. Maybe I'll just rotate this a little more. I might have to bring it back a little. That added another key frame in there. And you can see now that while it's still not the best camera shot, that Natalie now stays in the composition for the entire movement of the camera. Now remember that you can always adjust your keyframes in time, in the timeline. You can also delete keyframes if you don't want them. And I'm going to show you one other way that is actually a little more intuitive for moving your camera. If you remember, the way that we moved our camera is I went to preview and I actually physically moved the camera in 3D space, and I rotated it as well, like that. However, you may find it more intuitive to actually look through the camera and just navigate in that 3D space and place your cameras that way. So let's take a look at that real quick. I'm going to go back to my camera move. I'm going to get rid of these two keyframes, and we'll just pick a point on our timeline, perhaps frame 100. And this time, with my camera selected, I'm going to zoom in, and we'll just place the camera a little, maybe orbit it a little. And if we scrub in our timeline, you'll see that in fact the camera has been animated. Now, a couple very quick reminders before we wrap up this video. When you're working with animation, remember that you're doing your work here oftentimes in the timeline where you're working with the keyframes and adjusting their timing. Remember that if you don't actually see the object in your timeline that you want to be animating, if you don't see it here in this list, that you click on this button here, and then you can select it from these selections here. You can see that we have a number of different objects that could potentially be animated in here. Not all of them are visible right now, which is a good thing because you really only want to see what you're currently animating in your timeline. Otherwise, it'll become way too busy here in the timeline. Currently, I have the camera selected, the camera that I'm currently working on. But one other thing with that, and that is that here's the camera. We've got this drop down here, and you'll notice that there are actually some different properties that we can be taking a look at, such as depth of field, lens, constraint, and transform. So if you're not actually seeing the channel that you want to see, you can simply select it, and then you'll see that channel specifically with its keyframes visible in the timeline. And one other thing, and I just want to make sure this is very clear for you about the benefit of having these different cameras, but then also having your preview camera and using your preview camera as a working camera. And to illustrate this, I'm going to go ahead and create yet another camera because I want to show you something with this. So we've got a new camera selected that I just created. I'm just going to call this camera test. We're currently looking through it. And here's where you can accidentally mess up with this camera. And this is what I had done in some of my previous video work when I was showing you, where we had to clean it up a little bit, if you remember the previous video, when I was working with the switcher. So I'm looking through this camera, and let's just say that I scrub in my timeline. I'm going to hide the other camera. I scrub in my timeline, and I'm working on it on frame 200. Okay, and let's just say that I'm in my my camera here. It's not my working camera, and I start to use it as if it were my working camera. So in other words, I start to move it around placing it while I'm working. The problem is I just animated it, okay? Without actually intending on animating it, I just animated this camera. And that is because I moved it on a frame other than, let's say, the beginning frame, frame 1. So you'll see that, in fact, this is animated, even though that's not necessarily what I had intended on doing. Be very careful of that. Let's contrast that with our preview camera. So I'll go to my preview camera, and what you'll notice with the preview camera is that it does not behave that way. Very fortunately, it does not behave that way. We'll just kind of situate the camera. Currently, I am on frame 1. If I go to another frame, we'll go back to frame 200, for example, and I make some changes to it, and I scrub in it, notice it's not animated. That's what makes the preview camera very, very good for actually doing the work of placing objects and characters in your 3D scenes, because you're not going to accidentally animate it, unlike your other cameras. Anyway, that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next video.